one of the members of the audience to time? Oh, wonderful. None? Okay.
I can tell.
Yeah, we can tell if you want.
Okay. You can time. Okay.
You have your
No, I do.
Okay. Okay.
Today in this world, there is a group of people wrongly put in jails. A group left unjustly sentenced and unjustly treated by the institutions meant to promote justice. A group left on the outskirts of society to spiral down to a cackling cauldron of depression, hurt, and eventually recommitting the once crimes they were wrongly sentenced for. Before we move on to my constructives, let's talk about a few definitions for the House today. Firstly, by jailing someone, we refer to the process of taking a person out of society and isolating him or her in the judicial system itself. This is usually for long periods of time, and usually it applies to the most severe of punishments. For example, they are given to the most heinous crimes, the most unrepentant people in society, such as serial murders, such as rapists, just to name a few. Currently in the status quo, we see that even if a person has shown repentance, even if the person jailed has shown true reform, they still have to serve the very, very disproportionate jail sentences. We already see that this is currently failed because recidivism rates, especially in New York and Georgia, are sky high because they don't allow for reform under the current law. By ongoing threats to society, we refer to the people who show absolutely no chances of reforms, absolutely no repentance at all. And these people tend to intend to want to recommit the crime in the future. So let's look at our policy for today. No, thank you, man. We're going to split it up into two parts. How we're going to sentence these people, and what we're going to do with them when they're in jail and out. So let's move on. When we're sentencing the person, if the defendant can show that he or she is no longer a threat, we'll excuse him from jail. However, this does not mean that we're going to excuse him or her from all the other duties. For example, they're still going to need to pay a lot of restitution. This can include fines, community research, and, for example, apologies to the victims, which is all happening in status quo today. We already see this, similar in principle, where remorse is already a mitigating factor in many court cases when they're deciding the punishments for these people. So how do we know the person is truly remorseful when they're in jail? Well, this is assessed through experts and psychological assessments that's done while the person is in the jail. So this is done for a period of time to ascertain that the person has truly reformed and has truly changed his ways. This period of time of assessment is proportionate to the severity of the crime committed. I'm going to give you an example. If I murder someone, then of course the time that I'm going to be assessed is going to be much longer than, for example, if I was a shoplifter and I shoplifted something. So if the person is indeed excused from jail, what's going to happen is that the authorities are still going to keep track of this person. They're still going to monitor him or her for a long period of time to ensure that they are reformed, that they don't commit the same crimes again, and so that they are safe to go back into society. This is similar to parole already seen in the status quo, where if a person has shown reform, they're going to be let out of jail. Already done in many states across the world. So, if there are reoffenses for these criminals, if they do commit real crimes again, then of course we're going to send them back to jail. Today, we are going to argue to you that we are the side that best upholds the principles of justice, and we are the side that best incentivizes reforms. So let's move on to our case divide. I'm going to be arguing that we better incentivize reforms, and that their model provides a very disproportionate justice system. My second speaker is going to talk to you about how we encourage societal acceptance of these ex-convicts, and how we encourage closure for victims. Together, we're going to show you that jails fail in the rehabilitation of these people. So let's move on to my first perspective. Currently, when a person commits a crime, they're sentenced to jail. No, thank you. In a jail, because he or she recognizes that there is absolutely no chance of him or her getting out, there is no incentive for them to actually change their ways and change their methodologies of thinking. Because they recognize that even if they do change, there is absolutely no way for them to get out of the cell. These criminals, as a result, aren't going to reform, and as a result, the justice system fails, because jail does not rehabilitate the criminals that it put in. We give you the example of the Delhi gang rape in 2011, where the criminals were put in the jails for extremely long period of time. But when there was a documentary done, the criminals actually told the news reporters that they had no remorse, that they didn't regret the things that they did, and that they still felt that they were right in what they did. Clearly showing to us how the current model of rehabilitation has failed. So, when we understand that there is an ongoing threat, they can be free. So what happens under our model is that there's more incentive for these criminals to actually change their ways when they're in the jail cells. Because now they have hope, and they can start reforming themselves and rehabilitating themselves to prove to the rest of society and to prove to everyone else that they are indeed a changed person and indeed a changed criminal. Yes.
What mechanisms are you giving them to do this? If you're just letting them to get back into society.
As I've already told you in my policy, we're going to conduct psychological assessments. We're going to let experts review these people and evaluate to see how they are truly reforming. When they're out of jail, we're also going to track them to make sure that they aren't committing the crimes again. Clearly, we haven't really heard about that part. So now, because these criminals have hope, they can start reforming themselves and rehabilitating themselves. This is principally right, because the justice system is upheld since it can change the ways of the criminals. So when they go out to society, ladies and gentlemen, they are changed people, and they can go out back to contributing to the society they once came back. Instead of being subject to a life where they don't change their ways and when they're remaining as criminals frowned upon by the rest of society. So our side, in return, prevents these criminals from recommitting the crimes that they've once done. Recidivism rates on our side remain low, while on their side, as we've already proven, they remain sky high. Let's move on to my second substantive on disproportionality. So we start from the premise, let's evaluate the purpose of jails. Jails serve as the worst punishment for the worst crimes. They're meant to punish people. But even further, they're meant to keep ongoing threats away from society, because these threats can harm society and want to isolate them as a result. So when we recognize that a criminal is not an ongoing threat, it is principally unjust to keep him or her in. In the current status quo, however, let's go deeper in analysis. We see that there is a gradation of punishments for various crimes in the justice system. For example, if you commit a lighter crime, you get a lighter punishment. Heavier crime, heavier punishment. So when people stop their ways, and when people stop being a criminal, and when people stop having the incentive to commit a crime, thus, they should be given lighter punishments and should not be jailed as a result. But we can even extend this to how it harms third parties. We can extend it to how it harms the families. When a criminal is taken away from society and placed in a jail cell, what this does is it takes them away from many people, from all their loved ones. And there's justification for this when they're an ongoing threat to society. Because when you're an ongoing threat, you need to protect society, and therefore it's justified for you to keep them away. However, when the person is not an ongoing threat, ladies and gentlemen, if we were to take that person away, it is principally unjust, because there is absolutely no justification for why we're keeping that person away from the rest of society if that person cannot even harm society anymore. We've shown you in our policy how we can prove that these people aren't a threat to society, and we've shown you in our policy how we, in fact, increase rehabilitation rates and reduce recidivism rates. So for all these reasons, I'm especially proud to propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 5 seconds.
speech, and I would now like to ask the leader of the opposition if he would like to deliver the speech. Also, I apologize for butchering any and all of your names.
When side proposition comes up here and only deals with one of the many levels of justice, we say that they've already lost today's debate. When side proposition comes up here and doesn't understand how the levels of justice fundamentally work together, we say they've already lost today's debate. And when side proposition comes up here and tells us that something is wrong, but it's not always wrong, we think they lose today's debate. I'm Luna, and today I'll be showing you how we think that all these principles of justice need to work together, how jail allows us, and how there are other principles that need to work with justice that aren't just about practicality. So first let's look at their idea that when people are no longer a threat, we need to take them out of jail. So firstly, we tell you that we have systems that exist like this. We have parole, ladies and gentlemen. That when we have, but we think that this parole exists in a more regulated way, that we allow for them still to realize that what they did was wrong. Then they came up here and told us that they want lighter punishments. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, we think that punishments should be according to the crime, and we agree with that. If they steal a loaf of bread, obviously they're not going to be in jail for 20 years. That's just not right. But that doesn't mean that we show them that what they did isn't fundamentally wrong. We still need to show them that stealing that loaf of bread in proportion to the punishment, by showing them that punishment is always going to be and will always be fundamentally wrong. But more importantly, we say that when they aren't fully rehabilitated, we think that they can be a threat to themselves, and I'll be showing you how they won't be fully rehabilitated in my speech. But we think that the main problem with Proposition's case so far has been that they haven't shown us why it's legitimate to not always punish people for a crime that is always wrong, right? They haven't shown us why this shouldn't be a categorical imperative, and for that reason they remove it, right? But then they came up here and told us that these people won't be rehabilitated, that you let them back into society, if you don't let them back into society, they won't be rehabilitated. So we think that firstly, how do you think that they're going to be rehabilitated if they don't see the consequences of what they've done? We think that rehabilitation works with punishment and they work in unison. You can't be rehabilitated if you don't know that what you did was wrong and that you're not going to do it again. So now I'd like to move on to point of information, madam. Thank you. So we say that what justice is in society and why we value it. We set justice up to achieve societal order and societal well-being, right? And we think we do this in three ways. Firstly, with punishment and retribution. So when somebody has been victimized, we think that they have been hurt in a particular way and that the people that hurt them need to feel the consequences of hurting them. And that when people don't get punished, we think that society still continues to feel victimized and this victimization doesn't go away. But we also think there's an element of deterrence in this policy, right? So we think that firstly, when individuals see that they're going to go to jail and they'll have a worse lifestyle, they don't want to do that, they don't want to go to jail, they won't necessarily commit the crime. But secondly, we see that society as a whole sees that what happens to criminals when we do this, so we won't do it, and that creates a deterrence as well. And we think that their idea doesn't deal with deterrence. Their policy doesn't deal with deterrence at all. No, thank you. We think that their policy only deals with this idea of retribution, but it's not even real retribution because people aren't seeing the consequences. But then, rehabilitation. But now we have the last idea of rehabilitation, and we say that we have rehabilitation in two ways. Firstly, rehabilitation for the individual,
What
to
information, madam?
want them to help them get back into society and want to get them to achieve their aims, but also for society, so that when these people are rehabilitated, they can be safe in society and so that society can be safe. So we value all of these pillars of justice, but we value them when they're engaged together, right? So we value all three of them because they have different mechanisms to dealing with different crimes, right? So we have to have all three of them to deal with the justice system. But also we think that they target different actors. So we think that punishment obviously targets the person who committed the crime. We think that punishment obviously targets the person who was victimized. Rehabilitation targets the person that committed the crime. So we think that the second we exclude
What's
some
the
of these
information
levels of justice, we exclude certain people from the justice system, and we think that that's specifically harmful. So now let's look how we think the jail system achieves all of these three things. So we think that firstly, obviously, it achieves punishment by limiting people's ability to interact and engage with other people and by isolating these people. And we think that this is important because we think that it shows them how the victim felt in this way. But secondly, we think it creates some kind of deterrence in the jail system because people don't like that lifestyle. They obviously won't want to commit it. And lastly, we think it creates rehabilitation because society runs on the assumption, and this is very important, that we have an ability to change, right? That's why we have psychology, that's why we have support groups. So this punishment shows them that they were morally wrong, that what they did was not permissible and it cannot continue. But it gives them space to interact and engage with the punishment. So we think that they wake up every day, I'll take you in a minute, they wake up every day and they see that what they did was wrong. They wake up every day for that long time in jail and they understand what it meant for the people's lives they affected. Yes, sir.
If you think punishment is such a suitable method to reform a criminal, would you sentence everyone to 20 years in jail for any crime they commit?
No, okay, I don't understand why you're getting that. We think that crimes are proportional to their punishment. So obviously we think that stealing bread isn't as bad as murdering someone, like that's, we just don't think that's like that. But however, we do think that if somebody who's inherently violent steals bread, it's the same as someone who's not violent stealing bread. That's still the same principle behind it, right? So we think that without this jail system, we don't allow for these three things to work together. But more importantly, we say that justice is past these practical effects. We say that for society to work, we need to have some kind of social contract and moral framework that we all understand. For example, we allow freedom of speech, but we limit hate speech because we can't allow people to only act in their own interests. And when we think that people do things that challenge society, when they do things that challenge the well-running of this moral framework, we think that it goes past these practical effects. We think that they pose a threat to society. So we think that somebody stealing a loaf of bread is going against society's moral framework, and therefore is that threat that we talk about. So therefore everyone is a threat if they commit a crime, and therefore everyone should go to jail if they commit a crime. But also we look at this idea that justice aims to provide equality. That's the point of justice. Everyone is on the same grounds. So we say that when one crime is treated more importantly than another, we say that that victim in that one crime wasn't as victimized as another, and we think that that creates a harmful perception that certain people don't have certain values in rehabilitation and retribution. So because I've proven to you that we need to use all these three principles together, jail does this, and there are other principles in this, we believe we should take this forward. Thank you.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 28 seconds.
All right, thank you very much for this opposition speech. And moving on to the second speech of the proposition, will be delivered by Esther Alphonsus.
So they completely misunderstood what my first speaker was really telling you about, because we never came out here in my first speaker to tell you that we wouldn't stand for punishment. We still stand for punishment if the person is going to be an ongoing threat to society. And if the person is going to endanger the lives of people in society, we are going to enforce punishments, because we still do believe in the principles of justice that they told us that we didn't achieve. But so let me go on to prove to you how we did in the 3 layers that they've shown us on firstly punishment, secondly creating a deterrence, and thirdly creating rehabilitation, and also providing closure for the victims in this scenario. Firstly, they told us that we already have parole anyway in reply to our proportionality point. And when we asked you that what about proportionality in the justice system? And this is so key, because on our side we give the people that have committed the crimes the reason to actually reform, and therefore with our policy that is so aligned with principles to parole, we're able to change it. And they told us they have parole already, but the real problem is that parole in some cases only are enforced after 10 to 12 years. These are the sort of things that their policies would allow, therefore not incentivizing any reform in the first place, therefore causing a disproportionate system in the justice system, because you're not allowing the people enough of an incentive to actually reform. And also, even if the person had even a remorse in the first place, you wouldn't allow the person to work on it or develop it, and therefore really understand the wrongdoings of his actions, because in the first place you don't allow them parole. Moving on, they've also said that crimes always have to be proportionate to the punishment, and no matter how small, we still have to show them that it is wrong, and we're still doing that to our side. If the person had not shown any remorse because he had shoplifted and still thinks that what he did was right and necessary, we're going to tell them that yes, what you did was wrong, and therefore you're going to be punished, whether according to the sentence that was set out. Just because it was a small crime doesn't mean we're going to let you off. So we don't understand why they would come up to tell us that we are only disproportionating the crimes by not understanding the level of crimes and the level of punishments that go hand in hand together. And they told us that they haven't shown us why we gave up on punishment, that never happened, and they really weren't listening to what my first speaker was pushing for. In this very case, we were pushing for proportionality of the punishments, not by dismissing the punishments in terms when crimes were too small, because we're talking about the remorse and regret in the person itself, the perpetrator. On the point of deterrence, they then came up to say that people don't want to go to jail in the first place, so they won't commit the crime. And they said your side won't deal with it, and we don't have deterrence. We say this is completely not true, because we still have deterrence in place, because we're not dismissing punishments. We're only ensuring that people who have committed the crimes and have not shown remorse or regret will be given a longer sentence, for example, will be given more rigorous sort of rehabilitation, counseling, etc. Therefore, we still have the deterrence in place on our side, because we're not dismissing punishments in the very first place. And then they moved on to retribution, in which they talked to us about the closure for victims, and they told us that it won't occur on our side. We tell you this is completely not true. On our side, this happens more and more significantly, because on our side, we already set the narrative in the very first place. If the person and the perpetrator is set out into society and let back into society, it's shown that this person had been showing signs of remorse, had been repentant of his actions, and fully understood the harms that his actions or her actions had caused. Therefore, the retribution is so much more clearer on our side. The closure is so much more apparent, because the person coming back into society shows in the very first place he entered the society, he was let out of jail because he understood the propensity of his actions and the harms that it has caused, and therefore showing people that he wouldn't recur back into the state of committing the crimes again, and therefore showing a large state of repentance, whereas I will also be explaining that more in the logic of my substantive. And the point of disproportionality on our side, they never really completely hit it, only telling us that it's not proportionate because punishments are not in play. But on that point, I already showed you how that is not the case on our side. But before I move on, yes, ma'am?
You still haven't shown us why the perpetrator showing remorse means the action in and of itself is not consequentially bad.
Ma'am,
It's bad whether the person is sorry
Thank
or
you,
not.
madam. The point is that we still show that the problem, the consequence of the problem is still consequentially bad, because we still have punishments in place. But the very fact that remorse or repentance doesn't diminish it. We merely help them push through with the repentance, push through with the understanding of the consequences of the crime. Because we tell them that once you show remorse or repentance, we're going to help you re-enter society so much better on our side of the house, which I'll be also elaborating on my substantives. So this brings me on nicely to my substantive, facilitating re-entering society again in the mindsets of these
ex-convicts. So now it's status quo that people in society are already afraid of ex-convicts, not because they were convicts before, but because mainly that they don't know whether these convicts are going to recur back into committing their crimes over again. They're cautious and unwilling to accept them back into society. Therefore, right now when these convicts are released, they are released because they have finished their sentence, not particularly because they have shown any sort of repentance or remorse. Therefore, people find it hard to actually accept these convicts back into society. And we see this already happening in Singapore with the Yellow Ribbon Project, where people are so unwilling to enter and volunteer to help these organizations because they are unwilling to actually go and help these convicts because they are unsure whether they are fully reformed. Therefore, because there's no clear indication on their side, there's no clear indication of remorse and regret. Therefore, they cannot re-enter society. And why this is so bad is because they cannot integrate into society. The moment they can't do this, we actually increase the propensity or the probability of them committing their crimes over again because they can't get jobs, they don't get help, and therefore they resort back to their crimes and etc. But on the comparative, when we make it so apparent a point to only release the people when they have shown remorse, the government sends out a clear narrative that these released ex-convicts were released based on the very fact that they have shown remorse. This shifts the entire public opinion on ex-convicts, and this shows this top-down approach actually makes clear that these ex-convicts were remorseful and encourages people to actually accept them back to society. Therefore, with a changed government narrative, we help the ex-convicts re-enter society as a changed person, and therefore that was the very reason why he or she was released in the first place. So the second point of providing closure for the victim, on their side, when they throw everyone into jail, regardless of the repentance or reform, which is a key part to determining whether they will be put under our policy, they are not given the chance or ever need to truly show the regret or repentance. Therefore, closure for the victim is not assured or promised on their side. In jails, we don't actively see them going through reform. Therefore, closure is not really there for the people. And we saw this in the Ender Breivik case in Norway, where he killed 70 people and was completely unremorseful on the stands. No incentive to reform because he had no chance of reform anyway. But under our policy, we show you the comparative because we increase the probability of victims getting the direct closure that they really need. In the reform process, actually encourages and incentivizes these offenders to be repentant on what they did. We encourage reform. We encourage them to apologize and seek forgiveness from the victims. And since when the offenders are released only based on the understanding of the propensity of the crimes, we assure the victims that these perpetrators have learned their lessons and won't recur back to the state by committing the crimes that they had been put into jails for in the first place. Therefore, we provide a clear-cut narrative and closure for the victims by telling them these perpetrators have fully understood the extent of the crimes, and that is the very reason why they have been reintroduced into society over again. Therefore, because we are the ones that are willing really to encourage acceptance and change in society, and we are the ones changing the system for the safety of society as a whole, we best stand for the entire community.
Speakers hold for 8 minutes and 2 seconds.
Thank you very much for that speech, and it is now time for Zoe, as the second opposition speaker, to deliver her talk.
You have still not dealt with the victims and what the victims experience in these situations. So I would like to be proving the harms that implementing this motion represents, and then the three main pillars: punishments, rehabilitation, and deterrence once again, and how this actively harms the principles of the justice system which we value so dearly. But firstly, I would like to move on to rebuttal, and how we do not deny that crimes are punished on a spectrum. We agree. The worse the crime, the worse the punishment. The less the crime, the less the punishment. We agree with that idea. But they are still breaking a crime, no matter what the crime is. They are still swiping away a fundamental pillar of our justice system. Society only functions because we have an agreement and concord of what's right and wrong. So when you destroy this agreement or concord, regardless of what you've done, you've trampled down a pillar of our fundamental justice system, not taken. So that is why the spectrum system does not necessarily apply. We agree, it's there. The worse the crime, the worse the punishments, the least the crime, the least punishments. We agree with that. But regardless of where the crime exists on the spectrum, it still needs to be punished, and victims still need to be held accountable for this. You also said that they're going to feel remorse and that they're going to go through psychological testings, and this is going to encourage acceptance for ex-convicts. Is that correct? We're going to encourage acceptance for ex-convicts by allowing these people to have remorse and be accepted back into society. However, acceptance for ex-convicts comes when people see that these convicts have been held accountable for what they've done. That is why we need to give them the correct amount
Point
of
of
punishment.
information, madam.
Taken.
We believe on our side accountability still exists because we're not diminishing their crimes in any aspect. We're only helping them work towards reform so much more better on our side.
But this already exists. It's called parole. You're basically just funding parole and not the actual motion. We see that when people are individuals, as today, we have something called parole. They can reach performance and they can go on rehabilitation and they can be let out. However, what you guys are doing is you're taking away this punished element that is so closely married to this rehabilitation. Okay? So this is why I would like to move on to my substantial matter, being my first column being punishments, and how that actively harms our justice system. Okay? Punishment is based on the notion of delivering justice to victims. These victims need to get a sense that they are being accounted for, that someone has done something wrong to them. Now they need to get this idea that
Point of
they will be
information, madam.
taken.
We believe that these reforms are showing the people that these criminals have gone through reform has still happened on our side because we told you that they still undergo community service, they have reformative measures, they have rehabilitation and counseling. Therefore, these things are still apparent to the people on the ground.
No, but these things do not make up what people want to see. They want to see that crimes are being held accountable for. They want to see that people are being punished properly. They want to see that they are being excluded from society and being held in a safe place where they can rehabilitate. So back to my punishment. The state has an obligation to show justice back to these victims. So these victims need to see that they are being excluded from society and that these people haven't just shown some fake sense of remorse in some test and now they're back on the streets. They have possibly killed someone, they killed your father, but it's fine, you have remorse for it. You know, it's fine, they can go out. Or they've psychologically tested to feel bad. That's not good enough. What we really want to see is them being held accountable for what they've done. What we really want to see is people going to jail and sitting behind bars.
Point of information, madam.
Not taken. When people sitting behind bars because they have done something extremely incorrect, and that's what punishment is for. Punishment is for the victims. The victims want to see that they haven't just been unequal, that they haven't just been ruined in society. So then we need to look at how punishment prevents and deters. And I would like to flag this later on my speech. But firstly, we need to look at rehabilitation and rehabilitation and the individuals who are doing the crime. Rehabilitation is when we use jail because jail is the best means of justice that we have. For instance, we don't implement the death penalty because we still want people to get an opportunity to rehabilitate. So we don't punish them strongly, but we still want that opportunity to rehabilitate. However, we still put them in jail so that they can still get a sense of punishment.
Point of information, madam.
No, with an opportunity to rehabilitate as well. So that is why we see that these two are married so closely with rehabilitation and punishment. So we don't just implement the death penalty and kill people, but we do, jail is a form for them to rehabilitate in a safe place. You guys even stated that it was harmful because you were taking these people away from their families and excluding them from society. However, do we really want, no thank you, do we really want someone who's broken a fundamental pillar of our society's concord, do we really want them interacting with their family? Do we really want them acting as a role model within their family group? Then once again, jailing individuals who have broken the principle of justice system, they get the opportunity to rehabilitate. And implementing this motion has no, by implementing this motion, you take away the punishment aspect that needs to be valued. So you're only giving them the opportunity to rehabilitate, but we need to give them punishments as well. You can't mainly just focus on rehabilitation. Not taken. You can't just focus on how these people are going to get better and how they feel remorse. There needs to be an aspect of them being held accountable for which I stated before, is for the victims. We also need to look at human nature. Human nature is reckless and it is unpredictable. So what's to say that this person feels a fake sense of remorse and they're never going to do it again? It's fine.
Madam?
Not take it. We can just let these individuals back into society because, hey, a serial killer or a rapist said, we feel sorry, we feel bad, we passed a psychological test. Rape and murder is still wrong. They still need to go to jail for it. Just because they feel bad, or just because they pass a test, not taken. So now we have to look at deterrence and in society, how when we see people going to jail, and when we see people being fully held accountable for what they've done, society is willing not to go and implement those sort of crimes. What you guys do is condone for people to go, for society to do smaller crimes. Because as long as they can prove that they're not a long-term problem, as long as they can prove that they're not going to deter society in the long term, then it's fine. We're going to let them out. So that's why society needs to get the message and the perception that the justice system is being upheld correctly. And so that they don't go forward and do the same thing. So they can see that there is deterrence and they don't want to do that. Where you condone it by, if I do something wrong, it's fine, I'm just going to go into rehabilitation. If I do something wrong, it's okay, I can show remorse and I can just leave. That's why we need to send a message that the justice system is being upheld and that we will be held accountable for both the individuals and for society. So this is what we have shown you. We have shown you the harms on the 3 levels of punishment, rehabilitation, and deterrence in both of our speeches. And yet you still have not reacted on the victims and how you're really savoring the victims' best interests. Thank you.
Speakers spoke for 8 minutes and 16 seconds.
I just want to ask what the extent of communication from the floor and the bench is.
There should be any,
Okay.
except for time. Okay. If there is any communication from the audience towards the debate members outside of the time, no communication. Okay. Okay, so then calling on the 3rd speaker for the proposition, and I apologize for not being able to pronounce his name correctly, but I'll try. Udbal?
Yeah. They have fundamentally mischaracterized our entire case, accusing us of not standing for punishment. But what did we tell you right from my first speaker? We told you that we do stand for punishment. We are going to punish these offenders. Yet, if they show remorse, if they show that they understand the gravity of the situation, we're going to give them a chance to release. We're going to give them a chance to reintegrate back into society and not fall back into a cycle of crime. On the comparative, what is happening on that side? A person is in jail. He will not receive parole after 10 or 15 years. Yet he may be reformed, but still he is in jail. And why is it bad? Because when he's in jail, he's vulnerable to terrible influences such as gangs and other things. He may become depressed. He might fall into a cycle of crime because he's around gangs for too long, and he has no chance for release. And bearing this framework in mind, we are going to show you why we best fulfill two principles of justice, rehabilitation and restitution, because now we can agree that both sides are actually standing for punishment. So let's go to this whole idea when he gave you a third substantive on societal acceptance of ex-convicts. And here's something that they never really tackled. All they said was that societal acceptance only happens when the person is held accountable for his crimes. Our first response, we are holding him accountable for his crimes. But what we are telling him, no thank you madam, is that we're not going to jail you for unnecessary periods. We're still going to give you a chance for release if you show that you have reformed. And that's what happens on the comparative on the their cases, that when you jail them for a long period of time, there's a societal perspective that this person might be bad. So for example, if an ex-convict applies for a job, and then they see on the CV that this person was jailed for 20 years, there's an immediate perception within society that obviously this person is bad, he must have done something wrong. No thank you, madam. On the comparative, and therefore what does this mean? He finds it harder to get a job, he finds it harder to reintegrate back into society, and he falls back into a cycle of crime and commit another offense again and again. On the comparative, what did we tell you? We told you that the government, the biggest movers of public influence, should implement this policy. When they implement this policy, it sends a strong narrative out to society that if the person is released, he has truly reformed and not because he simply served out a sentence and might fall back into a life of crime. We are only releasing him because he has truly reformed. And therefore now when he goes and applies for a job, the employer will see, yes, because the government implemented this policy, this guy has truly reformed, I'm going to give him a job, I'm going to allow him a chance to reintegrate back into society and not fall back into a life of crime. Our point is still strong. Then let's go to this whole idea about closure to victims, which they made a big fuss about, right? And let me tell you why we do it better. Because what they said was that we should punish this guy because this will give more closure to victims, and what they're essentially standing for is vengeful justice. But let's go into the mindset of the victims, right? Because on their side, what takes place? The person might be in jail. He might be serving a 10 or 15-year sentence. However, he has no incentive to reform, as we've already shown you from our first speaker. When he has no incentive to reform, he does not understand what he did was wrong. He does not understand that the harms he caused to the victims were wrong. He does not understand the gravity of his situation. And what does this mean? This means there's less closure for the victims, because the victim, even though the person is in jail, she sees that this guy is not reforming, he's not understanding what he did was wrong. On the comparative, what did we tell him? We're going to tell him that, sir, if you should reform, if you actually put effort into attending your counseling sessions, if you actually put effort into understanding the gravity of the situation, what you did is wrong, the harms you caused to the victims, then what does this mean? That is when there's actually closure to the victims, because at least the victim is satisfied that at least this person understood that what he did is wrong, and therefore because he has more incentive to reform. And that is why our side best provides closure to the victims, because we actually give this person an incentive to reform in the first place, whereas on their side, he might be languishing in jail for 10 or 15 years, but he has no incentive to reform. Because even if he reforms, he will not be released from jail. So why should he reform? He'll just not attend his counseling sessions, he will not understand his counselors. Then we also told him, right from my first substantive, all this whole process of aiding the reformative process. And their only response to this was, I'll take in a moment, that rehabilitation works in unison with punishment. But before I move on, yes ma'am.
So you're talking about people who aren't able to reform in jail, now you want to let them back out into society, these people who aren't rehabilitated. So we need rehabilitation in jails first.
Thank you, ma'am. But the problem is there is rehabilitation in jail. But right now, the prisoners in jail have no incentive to reform under your side. Because even if they reform, they say, okay, I might be reformed, but the government won't let me out of jail, they won't give me parole, they only give me parole after 10 or 15 years. On our side, what are we saying? If you actually reform, even if it takes you 1 year to reform, if you reform, we're going to let you back out into society, and this is what provides closure to victims. Because they want to see the person reform, they want to see that the person understands what he did was wrong. No thank you, ma'am. And so, no thank you. So here we told that rehabilitation only works in unison with punishment. And I've already told you back from my start of the speech that now under our side there's more incentive for the person to reform, because if he reforms, he will get released. So he's more open to his counselors, he will attend all of his counseling sessions, and therefore when he gets back out into society, there's a less chance that he'll re-offend again. On the comparative, what they're going to do is simply say that we're going to let him stay in jail for 10 or 15 years, we're not going to provide him any incentive to reform. But after 15 years, when he gets out of jail, you know what he'll do? He'll fall back into a cycle of crime. Why? Because he never understood that the situation he did was wrong. The crime he committed on the victim was wrong. The rape he did was wrong. Then they also told us in the whole third substantive, this whole idea that jail somehow helps you understand the gravity of the situation, helps you realize the consequences. But no, right? What actually happens in jail? When you're sentenced to jail for 20 years and you have no chance for release, you only get more angry at your victim, right? Because you're saying that, okay, look, what I did was wrong, I might be willing to reform, but yet I have no chance of release. So that's when you get more angry at your victim, that is when you have less chance of reforming. And even worse, the longer you're in jail, the longer you're vulnerable to the terrible influences that exist in jail, such as drug gangs, such as crime gangs in prisons such as Mexico and Brazil. And therefore, on their side, rehabilitation simply does not work. And what does this mean? When rehabilitation does not work, even after he gets released from jail after 20 years, he'll commit the same crime again, he'll go back to jail again, and then after he gets released, he'll commit the same crime again. Their side is really not solving the problem at all, actually reforming these criminals and protecting society at large. On the comparative, we give him an incentive to reform and we protect society at large. Then we also told you in our second substantive, this whole idea about disproportionate punishment, right? There's some people who might have committed a crime, yet they're shown reform, that they're no longer an ongoing threat to society, yet we're punishing them and putting them in jail. Their only response to this was, oh, don't worry, there's systems such as parole that exist in the status quo. But how does parole actually work, right? When a person sentences you, the judge sentences you, he says, okay, I'm sentencing you for 20 years, but you're only eligible for parole after 10 years, right? So it's not something like, oh, you're only eligible for parole immediately, you're only eligible for parole after a certain period of time. So right, the person might have reformed in the intervening period before he was eligible for parole, yet he has no chance for release, leaving him more vulnerable to the terrible influences in society. No thank you, both of you. And they also told us, oh, we should have proportional punishment, things like that, and we agree with it. We agree that we should have proportional punishment, yet what our side is doing is that we're giving them a chance to release if they show reform and not leaving him in jail, providing him an incentive to reform. And then they also brought up this whole point about deterrence, and how their side actually allows for deterrence. Again, I'm going to clarify that we actually have punishment on our side, and also because what they actually stand for, if they actually stand for deterrence, right, then we might as well sentence everyone to 20 or 30 years in jail if that is what they really want, because that's the best form of deterrence. Right? But yet we will not do that. Why? Because there's no incentive for the criminal to reform, and therefore we're not upholding the principles of justice that they so desperately talked about. And then the final point, the last speaker came up with this whole idea of propensity for abuse, right? But really, we already buffered this last part of policy. We are saying that you're going to have psychological and expert assessments. Then, after that, there's a gradation of how we actually release you. We're still going to monitor you 24/7. If you still show reform, then we might only monitor you for 12 hours every day. So there's a gradation of how we actually release you. We're not going to say, okay, a rapist show reform, we're going to release you into society and let you run longer. No, there's a gradation process that we told you right from my first speaker. His entire substantive completely falls in and of itself. And because I've shown you how we best uphold closure for victims, and we actually have upheld the reformative process for these offenders, we win today's debate.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 14 seconds.
Great, thank you very much. And it is now time for the last of the substantive speeches delivered on the third halt by Katya.
Katya, sorry.
Oh.
I don't cross my T's, that's my problem.
Sorry.
Sorry. When they tell us when a rapist says they're sorry, it constitutes as justice, they lose today's debate. When they tell us that when serial murders are reformed, we would punish them with community service, they lose today's debate. They lose today's debate when they fundamentally misunderstand the reality of the justice system and refuse to engage with the fact that crime is just wrong. It is a categorical imperative, and no amount of reform excuses that crime or the hurt it causes. They lose today's debate when they concede that punishment is necessary and concede our principle, but then tell us that we would let them up in their reform, which is parole, which exists anyway. So I'm going to be dealing with my speech under the main clash of who best achieves justice, and in that, what is justice? So let's analyze what we heard from them and tell you why they're wrong. So the first thing is that they incentivize rehabilitation and that they're going to better rehabilitation. And we've got a couple layers of response here. First of all, we tell you that there's fundamental flaws in this logic.
Point of information, madam.
Because when you let them back into society with only some community service or some police officers watching you for 24 hours, you tell them that thinking they're sorry is enough to excuse their crime. You tell them that the crime in and of itself is not an inherently bad action, and you don't force them to engage with the fact that what they did was wrong, that they have to change. Then, what they think is that the fact that they've said they're sorry means that they're already rehabilitated, they're already fine. That's problematic. But two, you miss out the fundamentally important aspect of jail. which is jail limits their ability to interact with society in the same way they did before the crime. Jail forces them every single day to engage with the consequences of their action,
Madam?
with the hurt it caused them. We think that when you allow them just back into society, you don't show them every single day that it's wrong. You don't provide them the space to rehabilitate because someone is watching them, but they can just keep doing what they did before. You don't force them to engage with a crime. You don't force them to rehabilitate the same way jail does. But more importantly, we think that this just isn't enough. Even if they were going to rehabilitate like they were doing in jail anyway, we still think crimes are categorically wrong. We still think they need to be punished. We still think in the middle of Op 3, proposition needs to show us why crimes aren't categorically wrong. Then let's look at this next idea we heard about, like people aren't willing to engage with them when they come out of society, right? So here we tell you that proposition just means to engage with reality. If people aren't willing to engage and interact with a murderer who served 25 years and risked that part of his life, we just don't think they're going to be willing to interact with someone who's got out because they've passed a few psychological tests. That's not the way human beings function. That's not the way society functions, proposition. But more importantly, we tell you that if you think that people are going to interact with murderers because they've shown remorse, we tell you parole exists. That's the way it works. We think that people are more likely to engage with murderers when they once served a sentence, but then also being psychologically assessed, shown they've shown remorse, and then being released. We think that exists under opposition side when they are punished for their crime, when they show remorse, and when they're released. We don't think that just releasing them is going to encourage engagement, right? And then let's look at this idea of closure, and that the victims themselves are going to get more closure because these people have shown remorse. Here we just say once again, proposition really needs to engage with reality. We think when we talk about closure, when we talk about victims feeling it and like getting some kind of retribution, it's not just knowing that their murderer is sorry, because their murderer being sorry doesn't bring their dead husband back. It's knowing that that murderer is sitting in jail, suffering the same kind of pain they suffer for their loss every day. Crimes necessarily cause some kind of damage, that's why they're considered crimes. And we don't think the mere fact that the perpetrator shows they're sorry means the victim is going to get any kind of closure. That's not reality. And then, but let's look at regardless of what I just told you and how I've just taken down their points, why they still, yes sir.
So if you think that a person truly understands the pain caused to a victim, do you stand for eye for an eye justice? So if I rape a victim, I should be raped in jail?
No. We think that the way the justice system works is that it allows mechanisms which, one, punish the people so that they can feel crime, two, allow for rehabilitation, and three, encourage deterrence. We don't think that vigilante justice or an eye for an eye is the same as saying that you should feel pain. But we still think that because the justice system works in a proportional manner, it serves that same mechanism just within the frames of justice. But then, let's look at why they still lose today's debate. They have not dealt with the fact, the main principle of proposition, which tells us that crimes are wrong, that they need to be punished regardless of what the perpetrator feels. We tell you that we let them out when they feel remorse, but we still think they need to be punished. And we tell you, no thank you, sir. They still haven't dealt with that. They still haven't shown us why that's wrong. And then they fundamentally fail to show us how they're achieving any kind of justice by letting them out. But then, assuming we're not conceding that what they've said still stands, that they are still achieving rehabilitation, that they are like increasing rehabilitation, that they are increasing like retribution and enclosure for victims, that they are increasing acceptance, we still don't think this is good enough. Because they didn't engage with our analysis. 8 minutes of analysis to show you why, in order to achieve proper justice, we need all the principles of justice working together, working in unison. We don't think it's enough to just improving, no thank you sir, rehabilitation and retribution, because you're still leaving out deterrence, you're still leaving out punishment. No thank you sir. We still don't think it's good enough that they just improve these two things. But then, let's look at what we told you that they just didn't engage with at all, right? So we told you that the principles of justice are more valuable, they are inherently valuable in and of themselves, but they're more valuable when they work together, when policies allow them to work in unison, and when policies allow them to
information
interact with each other. We told you these mechanisms are specifically valuable when they work together because the different mechanisms target and allow for justice in different circumstances of crimes. We told you when you're dealing with a rape or with a robbery, you're dealing with different kinds of situations, you're dealing with different kinds of people, and therefore the more types of mechanisms we use to implement justice, the more aspects of that crime we can cover. But secondly, we told you that these mechanisms need to work together because they target different people. Punishment allows for the victim to feel retribution. Deterrence allows for the greater good of society. We therefore think when you leave any of these things out, when you implement policies which necessarily limit these mechanisms, you leave people out the justice system, you leave people out the process of justice, and you compromise justice's ability to function in and of itself. You do not achieve proper or sustainable justice. And then we told you why it specifically harms the principles of justice, because it harms deterrence, because obviously if they think they can pass the psychological test they won't go to jail, that just means that they're more likely to commit a crime. We told you that it harms the idea of rehabilitation because you don't force them to engage, you don't enforce them to interact. We told you that it harms the idea of punishment, and we told you that it entrenches inequality, which is fundamentally against the very principle and basis of justice. Ladies and gentlemen, because they think a murderer saying sorry excuses the crime, because their own policy is for all which exists anyway, we win today's debate.